I'm Greg Elbow from the Center for Social Justice and Socialist Project and Professor of Political Economy at York University. We've been hosting a number of talks on eco-socialism over the winter and now the spring, finally. Today's discussion is Green Cities Against Neoliberal Urbanism, Urban Planning in Toronto Politics. We've been holding these sessions at Beit Zitoun here, which is a meeting place for community politics, the left, and a center for Palestinian solidarity work in the city. Toronto is, of course, also a historical meeting place of the Indigenous peoples of Canada, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and others. This territory still remains part of the contested land claims of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. And it's terrific to be meeting here in this place to discuss these issues of Toronto politics. We've been organizing a number of talks on eco-socialism over the term, over the winter and today. As part of also the political work we've been doing in the city related to Line 9, there are members of the East End and West End against Line 9, dealing with the fight against tar sands. Some of the comrades are somewhere around here, maybe they have some publications. Also, we've been working on transit issues with the Free Transit Campaign and with TTC riders. There's a bunch of publications related to those at the back, as well as a range of other publications we've been doing over the last few years, so help yourself to those publications. This talk builds on what we've done earlier on, beginning with Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, to dealing with issues of First Nations rights, the tar sands, green jobs, global climate change, and a bunch of other things. We also decided to focus on aspects of urban politics, and so many ecological issues become concentrated in urban settings. 50% of the world's population now lives in urban settings, as reported by UN Habitat. The global slum population, obviously really adversely affected by ecological issues, is now approaching 1.5 billion. It's estimated about 3 million people die each year from urban air pollution, and on and on and on the litany of issues goes. Some of these issues, of course, are important for the city, directly for the cities in advanced capitalist countries, although obviously they take different form, but they are part of the processes of urban inequality that has been confronting Toronto, and the way that issues of ecological justice intersect with these issues of equality. There is so many ecological issues confronting Toronto, it's hard to kind of begin and end a list. Waterfront, failing infrastructure, a lake we can't swim in enough, the awful infrastructure we have, the problems of urban design, the need to address climate justice, obviously everybody knows the crisis of public transit in the cities, and so on. These are partly strategic issues that aren't just confined to ecological issues, but are also dealing with the confrontation of urban neoliberalism and the need to develop a broader socialist politics again. The agenda that's coming forward, as we know from the Tory mayoralty regime, is largely to P3 everything and to privatize and hope that some mythical creative class is going to find us a way out of this, out of the urban political crisis that confronts Toronto. We have a range of speakers today that are not going to only speak about Toronto, but also some of the global urban issues. Some of the most interesting writers and longtime comrades of mine, all of them, on urban issues in Canada and the world. We're going to start with Kanishka Goonewardena, Associate Professor in Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto, writer on Henry Lefebvre, critical urbanism, urban social theory, design issues, and so on.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, so thanks, Greg, again for inviting us, and me in particular, because I'm actually, I have to say, not an expert as such on environmental and ecological issues, but I'm always happy to help out Greg in whatever he does, and join a conversation with the Socialist Project.
He's always so modest, isn't
and I also, for better or worse, teach urban planning and urban design at the University of Toronto. And I ought to be able to say something about this topic. And the anticipating more detailed and profound, I'm sure, comments from Stefan and Lam. I'm going to try to sort of say some basic things for us to be able to start a conversation at the level that is necessary, I think, to really get into this question or the problem of green cities against neoliberalism. And so I will try to do in 15 minutes or so quickly 3 things. First, just talk a little bit about what is neoliberal urbanism, and then address the question, what does it mean to talk about this kind of opposition between green cities and neoliberal urbanism, against neoliberalism. And finally, given my own professional expertise, I was trained as an architect and an urban planner and so on. I will address a few technical issues, that dominate current political and planning related discussions in Toronto and other places in the world. And finally, if there's time for a conclusion, I wouldn't be able to conclude, really, but I will at least try to pose a couple of questions for further discussion. I think the first thing to note here is, we are talking about capitalism and neoliberalism, right? And I'm not trying to define any of these terms, because I'm sure everyone here knows what these things mean, but it is necessary, I think, to start at this kind of level. The neoliberalism is a particular historical stage and a political manifestation in the development of the historical evolution and development of capitalism. And it is characterized by relentless privatization and commodification of pretty much everything. The privatization of the social, not only economic stuff in the world, but everything else, right? To the benefit of the expanded reproduction of capitalism, that is to say, the accumulation of capitalist, profit, private profit at any cost, if you will. Right? So it represents a thoroughgoing commodification and a privatization of the world, both the social world and the natural world. If we can still, meaningfully make these kinds of distinctions. But I also want to make the point that contrary to some popular sort of perceptions or misperceptions, this neoliberalism, as we know it, simply doesn't mean the retreat, or the disappearance of the state, but rather a very particular kind of reformatting of the state in the interests of the dominant groups, if I may say so, in the interests of the 1%, right? So the state does not disappear in the case of neoliberalism, but it begins to serve a different purpose than what it used to serve, let's say, under Fordist or Keynesian kinds of stages of capitalism that preceded, what we call neoliberalism. So what are some of the symptoms of neoliberalism in this, understood in this kind of way? I would say, competition, individuals competing against other individuals, institutions competing against other institutions, and in the case of the QP 3902 and 3903 strikes, that many people here were involved in. We saw, the principle of competition, coming into the university, neoliberalization and corporatization of the university, where universities compete against each other, departments compete against each other, and so on. So here, of course, what is necessary for us to note in particular is, under neoliberalism, how cities also try to compete against each other, right? The competitive urbanism, that kind of provides the general framework for this kind of discussion, in my opinion. And in a more kind of a cultural sort of register, we also have this phenomenon of, everyone trying to prove that they are better than the other, including cities. And I would kind of try to summarize all of that under this increasingly inescapable discourse of excellence. Excellence, and so on, right? And so neoliberal urbanism then, it under this kind of condition refers, of course, as we know, to the wholesale privatization of a range of public goods, public amenities, services that used to be provided not under the framework of capitalist profit making, but under more social and under a different social and political principle, right? And in more concrete sort of planning related terms, this means in the with regard to the provision of the essential kinds of public services that a city needs, the increasing reliance on so-called investors and the private sector and so on, as the municipal government, but also other levels of the government, the provincial and the federal, become according to this discourse, simply incapable of doing what they are supposed to be doing. And if you begin to talk about then neoliberalism in Toronto in particular, I think the most sort of striking problems would pertain, in my opinion, to public housing. Since the the 40s sort of principle of social housing was simply done away with, starting with Harris and those kinds of neoliberal regimes in the starting in the 90s, and also the transit problem that Greg referred to. But of course, in the context of all this, we see an increasing or a sustained investment, for example, in the biggest budget line item in Toronto for the police, right, to deal with the same kinds of problems. So it's a policing solution, law and order kind of solution, also facilitated by the whole anti-terrorism discourse since 9/11, and the recent bill 51, which is also C51. C51, is also, I think, in my opinion, to be kind of understood as relevant to all of this, the dynamic of neoliberalization. And what are the consequences that we can clearly see? The gentrification, is obviously one, but more generally, the polarization of Toronto, particularly, between sort of a nice, walkable, interesting kind of urban space, urban life, in the central core areas like where we are right now, for example, and other, outlying areas that are much more poorly served in terms of these kinds of nice urban amenities, right? So it's in this sense, the experience of neoliberalism has clearly provided, what many people have identified in different ways, a divided city. Okay, now if this is how we might understand neoliberalism and neoliberal urbanism, what are the prospects of an agenda of green cities successfully opposing these logics and dynamics of neoliberalization of urban space of the city, and here the question that we cannot avoid is, of course, what does opposing neoliberalism require politically, right? And clearly, I would say, although this is a planning and urban discussion, it involves more than planning. It involves like a political response. The only solution can be a political solution. So it really depends on the capacity of people to organize themselves in strategic and coherent ways that are, in the existing but also non-existent, political ways capable of resisting these fundamental logics of dynamics of neoliberalism. Okay? And with respect to planning, we can clearly ask the questions here today, in a city like Toronto, who plans for whom, right? Clearly, planning is today a technical expertise and a practice, dominated by a profession, planning profession, and also a political regime, that, as I said, is increasingly taking all of its cues, from so-called investors or the private sector. Right? So how can we even think about, fundamentally opposing, these very deep-seated, and processes and logics, that have really consolidated themselves very strongly in the last, especially over the last 15 or so years in Toronto. And in the kind of the left critical planning literature and discourses, that I spend some time with, in my university with my students, and also, occasionally with some activist circles here and there. We have or there is a concept called the right to the city, right? Which, Stefan and others can speak more substantively about this, but basically it refers to the idea that, people should be able to participate and manage, self-manage, the processes by which their own city is produced, right? And historically, as a point of, intellectual interest, this slogan, the right to the city was proposed by the French Marxist philosopher who wrote a lot about space and cities, Henri Lefebvre, and but in the interest of time, to be brief, let me just say that, the right to the city, in the way that Lefebvre and, other activists imagine, okay, does not exist. It is something to be struggled for, right, by the people who actually do not have a say in how the cities that they live in, or the spaces that they live in, are produced, by precisely these political economic forces of neoliberalism. So the right to the city does not exist for the most part. It is something to be struggled for. And there are some, and it involves at the core, I think, this idea of self-management. The communities, being participating, in a meaningful way in the production of the environment that they live in, right? And but this is something that does not really exist today, according to the, within the available, political processes, such as, voting every 4 years in a municipal election or a federal election, and so on and so forth. These are not, these kinds of options, do not present us with proper or meaningful choices, in my opinion. There are a couple of examples that we can point to, for example, of examples of the right to the city. I'm thinking of cities like Porto Alegre in Brazil, where they have with some success instituted a mechanism of what is called participatory budgeting, right? I mean, these are not necessarily world-changing, revolutionary sort of upheavals, but nonetheless they kind of point to the direction in which we have to move. If the right to the city idea is to be actually realized, and become meaningful. So participatory budgeting simply is communities, neighborhoods sort of getting together and deciding how, not the whole budget, but a small fraction of it should be invested, in the production of public goods, basically. But the idea, but when we think about nature, and we had to at some level, also talk about here, or think about at least having our backdrop, this relationship between nature and capitalism, and how we kind of think about this. And I mean, it is almost a cliche now, after people like Slavoj Žižek and Frederick Jameson, to say that it is much easier for many people to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, right? But that difficulty also, in an interesting way, I think suggests to the difficulty that we have in thinking about precisely this relationship between nature and capitalism, right? And so if we in relation to all of this, these kinds of considerations, I would say that when we are talking about green cities, sustainable urbanism, and all of these kinds of things, we have to kind of make some kind of a fundamental distinction between which kinds of initiatives actually challenge capitalism in a meaningful, fundamental way, which kinds of initiatives provide, less inspiringly means for accommodating ourselves somehow within the dynamics of capitalism, right? So sustainability, I would say, is not one of my favorite words for this reason, because it has become so co-opted, by the mainstream kind of, institutions and forces of, capitalist development, right? It is sustainable for capitalism, for sure, but not necessarily for a lot of people in the world, including, those who languish in the so-called land of slums that Greg mentioned earlier. To talk about some technical issues related to planning, urban planning. Now, it is clear that when we talk about ecological politics, environmental politics, that in addition to, or far more effective than doing the right kinds of recycling and as individuals kind of being responsible about the environment and so on, the kinds of cities that we live in have a huge impact, or actually have a huge impact on the environmental costs, if you will, and in other words, the form, the structure of the kind of cities that we have turn out to be decisive, when we think about, how to intervene in environmental questions, right? And I think, this important point has been, quite broadly recognized, even in mainstream circles to some extent. And this we can see, for example, it is much more effective to have a, efficient transportation system, than, figuring out where to put, where to put your trash in the recycling bins, and so on. And so transit, transportation infrastructure, the physical form of the city is is quite decisive, when we think about ecological issues. And so is, the question of, urban sprawl, and related question of urban sprawl, and, what, planners and urban designers these days call density, right, urban density. But again, density in the sense, there are, all kinds of studies that suggest that, for example, a city like, urban form like Manhattan, is much more efficient, in a kind of a resource use point of view, from a resource use consumption point of view, than a city like, let's say, Los Angeles, or Phoenix, Arizona, right? And and it also, lends itself to more interesting kinds of urban social and political life, when people are can see each other and run into each other in the streets and cafes and so on. And this is why some of us like to spend a little bit of time in Paris and Berlin and so on, right? When we get the chance. So but I would so I think the point I want to say is the importance of transit and density has been the importance of these two has been recognized even in mainstream circles, but there's a the fundamental kind of error of mainstream planning also has to do with the kind of the exclusive focus on these formal measures like transit and density at the exclusion of all the social and political considerations. So to put it in a kind of a simple way, like we have actually like a good density with all the condos going up and so on in the downtown area, right? But this is hardly sufficient to address the problem of the divided city, and the problems of polarization and so on. So if we get all the technical variables right somehow, as planners try to do this typically, we are still left with problems of gentrification and polarization and division in the city. And this is certainly socially not sustainable, and in the long run it is environmentally and ecologically unsustainable as well. And so my warning here would be to be always suspicious of these technocratic technical solutions that leave out the political social dimensions of urban life, broadly speaking. Okay? And I wanted to show just one couple of 1 minute clip of a city that I come from from Sri Lanka. Yeah, this is the capital city of Sri Lanka, and I'm just going to show you 1 minute from a massive urban redevelopment project that is planned right near the waterfront edge of this place. And I chose this because it illustrates a great deal of the sound is not there, but it's okay. It's better actually without the sound so that I can speak. It illustrates the ideology of urban development and urban design that is dominant and actually global today. So this is basically a promotional piece for a new city in Colombo, all built on reclaimed land, like part of the waterfront in Toronto. And in this case, the Chinese have provided most of the loans, right? The Chinese banks, right? And the communications and construction infrastructure company of China is behind this. I mean, I don't want to sound anti-Chinese or xenophobic. I'm just kind of in that sense, but I just want to show you kind of the nature of urban design, the aesthetic ideology of urbanism today. I mean, it looks beautiful. It has lots of trees. Of course, it's easy to have trees. Trees grow on concrete in Sri Lanka. It's not a big problem, but yeah, so and I by random coincidence, I met the vice president of the company who's promoting this project in China in April, because there's a kind of a debate about this, and I made some mildly critical remarks about it at a meeting in China, and the first thing he assured me was, we love Sri Lanka, we want Sri Lanka to develop, and by the way, we've hired the best environmental consulting company to do the environmental impact assessment for this project, and we got A grade pass, right, on environmental issues. But of course, anyway, I think you get the drift of it. So so I will simply conclude with that by asking the question: you know, are we, you know, what do we really mean by, you know, green cities, you know, against neoliberal urbanism? So I'll stop there. Thanks.